I was sitting in my sister Patricia's sunroom, drinking chamomile tea and watching hummingbirds dart between the feeders, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. At 70 years old, I've learned that unknown numbers usually mean someone trying to sell me something I don't need, or warn me about a car warranty that doesn't exist, but something made me reach for that phone, and I'm grateful every day that I did, because that single call saved me from losing everything I'd worked my entire life to build. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Chen, my neighbor of 15 years. She sounded breathless, almost frantic. "Dorothy," she said, "I don't know how to ask this, but are you really selling your house?" I felt my teacup pause halfway to my lips, confusion washing over me like cold water. Selling my house? The question made no sense. I was visiting my sister for 2 weeks, just like I did every spring. My house wasn't for sale. I told Margaret she must be mistaken. Maybe she had the wrong address. But her next words made my blood run cold. "Dorothy, I'm looking at the listing right now. It's your house, your living room, your garden. There are professional photos and everything. It says you're moving to assisted living." My hands started shaking so badly that Patricia had to take the phone from me and put it on speaker. Margaret was still talking, her words tumbling out faster now. "The sign went up yesterday morning. A big red and white for sale sign right on your front lawn. I thought maybe you'd made a sudden decision, but it seemed so strange that you hadn't mentioned it. And then I saw the listing online and it just felt wrong. The description says the property will be vacant by the end of the month." "Dorothy, what's going on?" I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, my chest felt tight, and the room seemed to tilt sideways. Patricia grabbed my hand, her grip fierce and steady, grounding me. She spoke into the phone, asking Margaret to send the listing link, asking if she'd seen anyone at the house, asking questions I couldn't form because my mind was racing too fast and too slow all at once. Margaret promised to forward everything and to keep watching the house. After we hung up, I sat there in stunned silence, staring at my phone as if it might suddenly tell me this was all a terrible mistake. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story from. I need to know I'm not alone in this, that other people understand what it feels like when your own family betrays you in the most calculating way possible. The listing arrived in my email 3 minutes later. Patricia opened it on her laptop while I looked over her shoulder, my reading glasses trembling on my nose. There it was. My house. My beautiful 3-bedroom colonial with the blue shutters I'd painted myself just 2 summers ago. The front garden where I'd spent 30 years cultivating roses, daylilies, and the Japanese maple tree my late husband Thomas had planted for our 25th anniversary. Professional photographs showed every room I'd decorated, every piece of furniture I'd chosen, every family photo on every wall, but it was the description that made me want to scream. "Beautiful 3-bedroom family home in established neighborhood," it read. "Original hardwood floors, updated kitchen, spacious backyard, perfect for entertaining. Elderly owner relocating to assisted living facility due to declining health. Motivated seller. All reasonable offers will be considered. Most furniture and personal items negotiable and can remain with property. Serious inquiries only. Property will be vacant by month's end. Schedule your showing today. Declining health. Assisted living facility. Vacant by month's end." These were lies, complete fabrications, but they were written with such confidence, such authority, that anyone reading them would believe them without question. I felt violated, exposed, as if someone had stripped away not just my home but my dignity, my autonomy, my very identity. The listing made me sound like a confused old woman who could barely care for herself, someone whose family was kindly helping her transition to a care facility where she belonged. Patricia's face had gone white with fury. "Who did this?" she demanded. "Who has access to your house? Who has keys?" I thought about it, my mind still sluggish with shock. My younger daughter Emily had a key, but she lived in Portland and we'd just talked 2 days ago. She would never do something like this. My neighbor Margaret had a spare key for emergencies, but she was the one who'd called to alert me. And then there was my son Jason, my firstborn. The child I'd sacrificed everything for. The one who'd always been so charming, so persuasive, so good at making you believe he had your best interests at heart. Jason had a key. Jason knew I was visiting Patricia for 2 weeks. Jason had been asking increasingly pointed questions about my finances, my plans, my future arrangements, as he called them. And Jason, I suddenly remembered with a sinking feeling, had mentioned last year that he was taking some kind of real estate course. At the time, I'd been proud, thinking he was finally getting serious about a career after years of jumping from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. Now that pride turned to ash in my mouth. I scrolled down to the listing agent information, and there it was. Jason Whitmore, licensed real estate agent. My son. My 42-year-old son who lived in my basement apartment rent-free. My son who I'd lent $15,000 to just 6 months ago for what he called a business opportunity that never materialized. My son who had borrowed my car, my credit cards, my trust over and over again, always with promises to pay me back, to do better, to finally get his life together. That son was now trying to sell my house out from under me while I was 200 miles away visiting my sister. The sunroom suddenly felt too small, too bright. The cheerful hummingbirds outside an obscene contrast to the darkness flooding my heart. Patricia was already on her phone, pacing back and forth, her voice tight with controlled rage as she spoke to someone. I caught fragments. Real estate board, elder abuse, fraud, illegal activity. But I barely heard her. I was staring at those photographs of my home, trying to understand how my son could do this, how he could walk through the rooms where I'd raised him, photograph my belongings, my memories, my life, and package it all up for strangers to purchase. The worst part was the comment section beneath the listing. Prospective buyers had already left questions. Is the owner willing to negotiate on the furniture? What's the timeline for closing? Can we schedule a viewing this weekend? They were circling my home like vultures, these strangers, discussing my life, my possessions, my future, as if I had no say in any of it, and they had no idea they were participating in a crime, that the motivated seller they thought they were helping was actually being robbed by her own child. I want you to understand something about my house. It's not just property, not just an investment or an asset to be liquidated. That house is where Thomas and I brought both our babies home from the hospital. It's where Emily took her first steps in the kitchen, where Jason learned to ride his bike in the driveway. It's where we hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties and Sunday brunches. It's where I nursed Thomas through his final illness, where he died in our bedroom with me holding his hand, where I've kept his memory alive in every room. That house holds 43 years of my life, and my son wanted to sell it in 2 weeks to people who would paint over the pencil marks on the doorframe where I measured my children's heights every year. I made a decision in that moment, sitting in Patricia's sunroom with cold tea and a heart full of fury. I would not let this happen. I would not let my son steal my home, my security, my peace of mind. I would not be painted as a confused, elderly woman who needed to be managed and relocated for her own good. I was going to fight back with everything I had, and I was going to make sure Jason learned that betraying your mother comes with consequences he never saw coming. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Patricia had finished her call and was looking at me with the fierce protectiveness that only a sister can have. "We're going to fix this," she said. "But we need information. We need to know exactly what he's done, what documents he might have forged, what he's told people. Can you handle making some calls?" I nodded, finding my voice again. I could handle it. I'd handled widowhood, raising 2 children mostly on my own while Thomas worked 70-hour weeks, and caring for both my parents through their final years. I could handle my son's betrayal, no matter how much it hurt. You might wonder how I ended up in this situation, how a mother could be so blind to her son's true nature. To understand that, you need to know about the family we used to be, before everything fell apart, before Thomas died, before Jason's charm turned into manipulation, before I learned the hard way that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you deepest. Thomas and I bought that house in 1982, when I was 27 and pregnant with Jason. Thomas was a mechanical engineer, steady and reliable, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and believed in hard work and integrity. We'd saved for 3 years for the down payment, cutting every corner we could. I remember the day we got the keys, how Thomas carried me over the threshold even though I was 8 months pregnant, and neither of us could stop laughing. The house needed work. The kitchen was avocado green, the carpets were orange shag, and the backyard was mostly weeds. But it was ours. We did everything ourselves. Thomas refinished the hardwood floors 1 room at a time. I stripped wallpaper and painted every wall, choosing colors carefully, creating a home that felt warm and welcoming. When Jason was born, Thomas built a cradle in the garage, sanding and staining the wood until it was smooth as silk. That cradle later held Emily too, and now it sits in my attic, waiting for grandchildren I thought I'd someday have. Jason was such a bright child, curious about everything, always taking things apart to see how they worked. Thomas was so proud of him, saw himself in that boy. They'd spend hours together in the garage, working on projects, Thomas teaching Jason about tools and measurements, and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Jason excelled in school, brought home perfect report cards, was popular with his classmates. Everyone loved Jason. He had this charisma, this way of making people feel special, like they were the most important person in the world when he focused his attention on them. Emily came along 4 years later, and she was different from Jason in every way. Quieter, more serious, content to read books or draw pictures while Jason held court with his friends. But they were close as children, the way siblings should be. I have photographs of them building snow forts together, sharing ice cream cones, Jason letting Emily win at board games. Those photos sit on my mantle now, reminders of what I thought we were, what I thought we'd always be. Thomas worked so hard for our family. He'd leave at 6 every morning and often wouldn't be home until 7 or 8 at night, but he never complained. Every penny he earned went into making our lives better. We paid for Jason's baseball leagues, his science camp, his school trips. We paid for Emily's art lessons, her books, her college fund. We took modest vacations, camping trips mostly because that's what we could afford, but they were filled with laughter and adventure. I thought we were building something permanent, a family that would stay strong no matter what life threw at us. But then Thomas started getting tired. At first, we thought it was just the long hours, the stress of a demanding job. He'd fall asleep in his armchair after dinner, wake up with no energy for the projects he loved. When he finally went to the doctor, they found the cancer. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, maybe less. Jason was 19. Emily was 15. And just like that, our perfect family started crumbling. Thomas died 7 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October. He'd held on longer than the doctors predicted, stubborn to the end, fighting to see Jason turn 20. Fighting to make sure Emily would be okay. I was 53 years old, a widow with 2 children still at home, a mortgage, and a grief so profound I sometimes couldn't breathe. The life insurance helped, but it wasn't enough to replace Thomas's salary. I took a job as a secretary at a law firm, worked there for 15 years until I retired. Every dollar went into keeping the house, keeping the kids fed and clothed and educated. Jason dropped out of college after Thomas died. He said he couldn't focus, that the grief was too much, that he needed time. I understood. We all needed time. But Jason's time stretched from months into years. He'd start jobs and quit them, claiming they weren't right for him, that he was meant for something bigger. He lived at home, rent-free, while he figured things out. I let him because he was grieving, because he was my son, because I wanted to help him find his way. Emily, meanwhile, finished high school with honors, worked 2 jobs to help pay for community college, and eventually moved to Portland to start a career in graphic design. She called every week, visited when she could, never asked me for money she knew I didn't have. Over the years, I gave Jason more than I could afford. When he wanted to start a landscaping business, I gave him $8,000 for equipment. The business failed within 6 months. When he wanted to buy into a friend's restaurant venture, I gave him $12,000 I'd saved for a new roof. The restaurant closed in a year. When he claimed he was finally ready to go back to school, I paid for 2 semesters of classes he never completed. Each time he promised this would be the one that worked, that he'd pay me back with interest, that I'd be so proud of him. And each time, I believed him because he was my son. And I wanted desperately for him to succeed. The basement apartment had been Thomas's workshop and storage space, but after Jason's 3rd job loss, I converted it into a small living area. I paid for the drywall, the carpet, the bathroom fixtures. I furnished it with pieces from the attic and a few things I bought secondhand. Jason moved in temporarily 7 years ago. He's been there ever since, paying no rent, contributing nothing to utilities or groceries, treating my home like a hotel where the staff happens to be his mother. I'd given Jason more than $70,000 over the past 20 years. Money I'd saved for retirement, for emergencies, for maybe traveling a little now that I was getting older. Money I'd earned by working overtime at the law firm, by skipping vacations, by driving the same old car for 15 years. I'd done it out of love, out of hope that this time would be different, out of the maternal instinct to help your child no matter what, and he'd repaid me by trying to sell my house while I was out of town. But sitting there in Patricia's sunroom, reading that fraudulent listing, I realized something I should have seen years ago. Jason hadn't loved me back, not really. He'd loved what I could give him, what he could take from me. The charming little boy who'd once helped Thomas in the garage had grown into a man who saw his own mother as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, an obstacle to be removed when convenient. And once I saw that truth clearly, everything else came into focus with devastating clarity. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I'd missed or rationalized away. The way Jason always seemed to be around when I paid bills, watching to see how much money I had. The casual questions about my bank accounts, my investments, whether I'd updated my will. The sudden interest in my health, asking if I'd been to the doctor, if I was feeling okay with this tone that suggested he hoped I wasn't. The way he'd started calling me Mom less and less, started treating me with this patronizing patience, like I was the child and he was the frustrated parent. Just 3 months ago, Jason had suggested I should think about simplifying my life. He'd brought it up over dinner, his voice all reason and concern. "Mom," he'd said, "this house is too much for you. All these stairs, the yard work, the maintenance. You're not getting any younger. Maybe it's time to look at some senior living communities. They have great activities, prepared meals, no more worrying about repairs or taxes." I'd told him I was perfectly capable of managing my own home, that I wasn't ready to leave, that I'd lived here for over 40 years, and planned to die here. He'd smiled, that charming smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "Just think about it." For me. Now I understood. He hadn't been concerned about my well-being. He'd been planning this, laying the groundwork, trying to make me doubt myself so that when he eventually pushed me out, I'd go quietly. The thought made me sick. How long had he been planning to sell my house? When had he taken those photographs? Had he brought the real estate photographer through while I was at my book club or the grocery store, staging my home like it was already his to sell? Patricia was making a list, her handwriting sharp and angry across the page. "We need to call your lawyer," she said. "We need to report this to the real estate board, maybe the police. We need to document everything, save that listing, screenshot the comments, keep records of every call and email. If he's forged your signature on anything, that's fraud. That's criminal." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere, thinking about Jason downstairs in my basement apartment, sleeping in the bed I'd bought him, using the electricity I paid for, probably already counting the money he thought he'd make from selling my home. Margaret Chen called again while Patricia and I were strategizing. She'd been watching the house like she promised, and she had news. "Dorothy, I just saw Jason leave with a couple. They looked at the house for about 40 minutes, walked through the backyard, took pictures. When they left, Jason shook hands with them like they'd reached some kind of agreement. He looked pleased with himself. My stomach turned. He was showing my house, bringing strangers through my rooms, my private spaces, my life, without my permission or knowledge. How many showings had he scheduled? How many people had walked through my bedroom, looked through my things, evaluated my home like it was nothing more than a commodity? I asked Margaret if she could do something for me, and God bless her, she agreed immediately. I needed her to watch the house carefully, to document everyone who came and went, to take photos if possible. I needed evidence of what Jason was doing, because I had a feeling this was going to get ugly, and I wanted to be prepared. Margaret said she'd do better than that. She'd talk to the other neighbors, get them involved, make sure someone was always watching. "We all love you, Dorothy," she said. "We're not going to let him get away with this." That night, I barely slept. Patricia's guest room was comfortable, but I kept thinking about my house, my things, Jason's betrayal. I thought about Thomas and what he would have said if he knew what his son was doing. Thomas had been tough but fair, believed in accountability and consequences. He would have been heartbroken, but he wouldn't have hesitated to confront Jason, to make him face what he'd done. I decided that's what I needed to do. Not just stop the sale, but make sure Jason understood exactly what he'd lost through his greed and deception. By the time the sun came up, Patricia and I had a plan. It would take a few days to set up, would require help from several people, and would need to be executed with perfect timing. But if it worked, Jason would learn a lesson he'd never forget, and I'd get my home and my dignity back. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not since Thomas died, maybe. I felt powerful, determined, ready to fight for what was mine. The first call I made was to my lawyer, Martin Chen, who happened to be Margaret's son and had handled Thomas's estate and my will. Martin was furious when I explained what was happening. "That's elder abuse," he said flatly. "And if he's forged any documents or misrepresented your mental capacity, that's fraud. We can have him arrested, Dorothy. This is serious." I told Martin I wanted to do more than press charges. I wanted to make sure Jason faced every possible consequence, legal, professional, and personal. Martin said he'd make some calls, do some investigating, and get back to me within 24 hours. True to his word, Martin called me the next morning with information that made my blood boil all over again. Jason had not only listed the house, but had already accepted a deposit of $20,000 from a young couple who thought they were getting a great deal on their first home. He'd told them I was his mother, that I was suffering from dementia, that I was eager to move to a care facility where I'd be better looked after. He'd shown them paperwork that looked official, power of attorney documents, medical evaluations, financial statements, all of it forged with my signature. "Dorothy," Martin said carefully, "he's been planning this for a while. This level of documentation doesn't happen overnight. He's created an entire false narrative about your mental state, your finances, everything. If you hadn't found out when you did, if that couple had closed on the house with him having forged all these documents, you would have been in a nightmare situation trying to prove the sale was fraudulent." The young couple, their names were David and Melissa Harper, Martin told me, had been told the closing would happen in 3 weeks, that it was being rushed because I wanted to move into the care facility as soon as possible. They'd been so excited about the house, Jason had told them, that he wanted to make it happen quickly before other buyers could swoop in with higher offers. They'd wired their deposit to an escrow account that Jason had set up using my name and a fake email address. Martin said the Harpers were victims too, that they'd been deceived just as much as I had. But that didn't make me feel much better. They'd walked through my home, planned where their furniture would go, imagined raising their future children in rooms where I'd raised mine. Martin had contacted the real estate board already, and they were taking the matter seriously. Jason's newly minted license was going to be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. Martin had also spoken to a detective at the police department who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly. "They want to talk to you," Martin said. "They want to build a case against Jason for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Are you ready for that? Because once we start down this road, there's no going back. Your son will likely face criminal charges." I thought about that word. Son. How much did it mean when the person who carried that title had violated every trust, every bond, every reasonable expectation of family loyalty? I thought about all the times I'd protected Jason, made excuses for him, enabled his failures because I loved him and wanted him to have another chance. I thought about Emily, who'd worked so hard, never asked for help she didn't desperately need, never took advantage of my love. And I thought about Thomas, who'd worked himself into an early grave to provide for our family, who'd trusted that his sacrifice meant something, that his children would honor what he'd built. "I'm ready," I told Martin. "Do whatever needs to be done." The investigation Martin and the detective put together over the next few days was thorough and damning. Jason had forged my signature on at least 15 different documents: the listing agreement, power of attorney forms, a medical evaluation claiming I had moderate dementia, bank statements showing accounts I didn't have, tax returns that had been altered, even a letter supposedly from me to the buyers expressing my gratitude that they were purchasing my home. He'd created an email address in my name and had been corresponding with the Harpers, answering their questions about the property, scheduling inspections, discussing terms. The detective also found that Jason had opened a bank account using my personal information, routing the Harpers' deposit there so he'd have immediate access to it. He'd already spent $7,000 of that money on a new truck, a flashy red pickup that he'd apparently been driving around town, showing off to his friends. The remaining $13,000 was sitting in the account, waiting for him to grab it before everything fell apart. But he'd made a critical mistake. He'd used his own driver's license to open the account, and the bank had security footage of him doing it. Martin explained that the evidence was overwhelming, that Jason had committed multiple felonies, that he was looking at serious prison time if convicted. But I didn't want to just hand everything over to the police and let the legal system handle it. I wanted Jason to experience what it felt like to be betrayed, to watch his plans collapse around him, to face the consequences of his actions in the most devastating way possible. And that's where Patricia's truly brilliant idea came in. Jason had scheduled an open house for that Saturday afternoon, 2 to 4 o'clock, trying to generate more offers to drive up the price. He'd advertised it online, put up balloons and signs, prepared the house like it was his to show. What he didn't know was that I'd be there too, along with Martin, the detective investigating the case, a representative from the real estate board, Margaret and several other neighbors, and Emily, who'd taken emergency leave from work the moment I told her what was happening. We were going to turn Jason's open house into his worst nightmare, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the days leading up to that moment, because Jason's confidence and carelessness during that time revealed just how little he thought of me, how certain he was that he'd gotten away with everything. Margaret had been watching the house like a hawk, documenting everyone who came and went. Jason had scheduled 4 more private showings between the first one and the open house. Margaret got photos of every buyer who showed up, every conversation Jason had on the front lawn, every smug smile he gave as he locked up my house and drove away in his new truck. She also noticed that Jason had been removing things from the house, small valuable items that he probably thought I wouldn't miss right away. The silver tea service Thomas's mother had given us, a painting I'd inherited from my grandmother, the antique clock from the mantel. He was ransacking my home while pretending to sell it. I called Emily to tell her what was happening, and I'll never forget the stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Mom," she finally said, her voice shaking with fury. "How could he do this to you? How could anyone do this?" We talked for 2 hours that night, Emily crying, me crying, both of us trying to understand how Jason had become this person. Emily told me things I hadn't known, that Jason had asked her for money multiple times over the years, always with sob stories about emergencies or opportunities. She'd lent him $5,000 3 years ago that he'd never repaid. He'd also asked her to invest in his various schemes, but she'd always refused after the first loan disappeared. "I should have told you," Emily said, guilt heavy in her voice. "I should have warned you what he was like. But he's my brother, and I kept hoping he'd change. I kept thinking maybe if I didn't enable him, if I set boundaries, he'd finally have to grow up. I never thought he'd do something like this." Never. I assured Emily that this wasn't her fault, that we'd both wanted to believe in Jason, that hope wasn't something to apologize for. But I understood her regret because I felt it too. The waste of all those years, All that money. All that love given to someone who saw it as nothing more than his due. Emily booked a flight for Friday evening. She'd arrive late, stay at Patricia's with us, and be ready for Saturday's confrontation. She wanted to see Jason's face when he realized what he'd done. Wanted him to know that she knew, that the whole family knew what he was. "I'm done protecting him," Emily said, steel in her voice. "I'm done making excuses. He needs to face what he's done, and he needs to know he's lost both of us, not just you." Meanwhile, Martin was working with the detective and the real estate board to prepare for Saturday. They wanted to catch Jason in the act, wanted him to show the house to people while claiming to represent me, wanted him to accept offers and negotiate terms. Every word he spoke, every lie he told would be documented, recorded, used as evidence against him. The real estate board representative, a stern woman named Carol Jennings, told Martin that Jason's case would be one of the most egregious violations she'd seen in her 20-year career. "We take fraud seriously," she said. "But fraud against your own parent, exploiting the relationship and trust? That's beyond the pale." The Harpers had been contacted by the detective and were cooperating fully with the investigation. They were devastated to learn they'd been scammed, that the house they'd fallen in love with was never really for sale, that the warm, concerned son they'd met was actually a criminal. Melissa Harper had cried on the phone with Martin, apologizing to me even though she'd done nothing wrong. "We thought we were helping you," she'd said. "Jason told us you were lonely, that you'd love knowing a young family was going to make memories in your home like you had. We believed him. We trusted him." I felt terrible for them, these innocent people who'd been caught up in my son's web of lies. I spent Friday preparing myself mentally for what was coming. Patricia kept asking if I was sure I wanted to do this, if I was ready to see Jason arrested in my own home, if I understood that this would permanently destroy whatever relationship we had left. I told her I was certain, that the relationship had already been destroyed by Jason's choices, that I was just acknowledging reality. But privately, in the quiet moments when Patricia wasn't watching, I grieved. I grieved for the little boy Jason had been, for the father he'd lost too young, for the man he could have become if he'd chosen differently. I grieved for the mother I'd been, who'd loved too blindly and enabled too freely. And I grieved for the family we'd never be again. Emily arrived Friday at 11 p.m., exhausted from travel but wide awake with emotion. We stayed up until 2 in the morning, the three of us, Patricia, Emily, and me, sitting around the kitchen table, drinking tea, talking about everything. Emily shared more stories about Jason's manipulation, his lies, the way he'd always played on people's sympathy and goodwill. Patricia talked about the times she'd tried to warn me about Jason, the conversations I'd shut down because I didn't want to hear it. And I talked about the guilt I felt, the wondering if I'd failed as a mother, if I'd done something wrong that made Jason turn out this way. "You didn't fail, Mom," Emily said firmly. "Jason made his own choices. You gave him everything: love, support, money, chances. He chose to throw it all away. He chose to betray you. That's on him, not you." I wanted to believe her, but maternal guilt is a powerful thing. Even knowing Jason was a thief and a liar, part of me kept asking what I could have done differently, what I'd missed, what warning signs I'd ignored. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that felt like a mockery of what was about to happen. We drove back to my town, stopping first at Martin's office to coordinate with the detective and Carol from the real estate board. The detective, a middle-aged man named Frank Lawson, went over the plan one more time. They'd arrive separately at the open house, posing as potential buyers. They'd let Jason do his sales pitch, ask questions designed to get him to repeat his lies about my condition and eagerness to sell. Martin would record everything on his phone. Once they had enough evidence, Detective Lawson would identify himself and place Jason under arrest. I would arrive last, about halfway through the open house, making an entrance Jason wouldn't be able to explain away. The neighbors had been briefed and would also attend, filling my house with people who knew the truth, who could testify to my competence and independence. It was going to be theater, yes, but it was also going to be justice. We arrived at my street at 2:15, parking around the corner so Jason wouldn't see us immediately. Margaret met us first, hugging me tight, her eyes fierce with protective fury. "He's been here since noon," she told me, "setting up signs, arranging furniture, acting like he owns the place. Dorothy, he moved your mother's portrait into the closet. He said it made the living room look too personal. I wanted to march over there and drag him out by his ear." Other neighbors appeared, Bill and Susan from 2 doors down, the Martinez family across the street, old Mr. Peterson who'd been on the street longer than anyone. They all wanted me to know they had my back, that they'd been horrified by what Jason was doing, that they were ready to support whatever I needed. At exactly 2:30, Martin, Detective Lawson, and Carol entered my house separately, each one blending in with the small crowd of actual potential buyers who'd shown up. Patricia, Emily, and I waited, watching from Margaret's living room window, seeing people come and go, seeing Jason in his element, charming and confident, gesturing at my home like it was his to give away. Emily was pale, her hands clenched into fists, breathing carefully like she was trying not to explode. Patricia kept one hand on my shoulder, grounding me, reminding me I wasn't alone. At 2:50, Martin texted me, "Now. Come now. He just told Detective Lawson that you're in a memory care unit and don't even remember owning the house." We walked across the street together, the three of us, sisters and daughter, ready for battle. The front door was open, balloons tied to the mailbox, Jason's new red truck prominently parked in the driveway like a trophy. I could hear voices inside, Jason's the loudest, saying something about the kitchen being perfect for a family. My kitchen, where I'd made breakfast for my children for 18 years, where Thomas and I had shared morning coffee and evening wine, where I'd cried alone after he died, surrounded by his absence. I walked through my front door for the first time in 2 weeks, and the conversation stopped dead. Jason stood in the middle of my living room, frozen mid-gesture, his face cycling rapidly through confusion, recognition, and pure terror. He looked at me, then at Emily beside me, then at the other people in the room who were suddenly watching him instead of the house. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "Hello, Jason," I said quietly. "I'm home." The room seemed to hold its breath. Jason's face had gone from its usual healthy color to a sick grayish white, his eyes wide and darting around like a trapped animal looking for escape. "Mom," he finally managed, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here? I thought you were at Aunt Patricia's for another week." "I was," I said, stepping further into my living room, my gaze taking in the changes he'd made. My mother's portrait was indeed missing from above the fireplace. The family photos on the side table had been rearranged to show less personal history. He'd even brought in a bowl of fake lemons for the coffee table, some ridiculous staging trick he'd probably learned in his real estate course. But then a very kind neighbor called to tell me someone was selling my house. Imagine my surprise. Several of the potential buyers were looking confused now, glancing between Jason and me, beginning to realize something was very wrong. One woman whispered to her husband, and they started edging toward the door, but Detective Lawson stepped forward, blocking the exit, his hand moving to his badge. "Everyone please stay where you are," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm Detective Frank Lawson with the police department. This is now an active crime scene." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Jason took a step backward, shaking his head frantically. No, this is a misunderstanding. Mom, tell them this is a misunderstanding. We talked about this. You agreed." His eyes were pleading with me now, trying to invoke that old dynamic where I'd smooth things over, make excuses, protect him from consequences. "We talked about what, exactly?" I asked, and my voice was steady, cold, nothing like the accommodating mother he was used to. "When did we talk about selling my house? When did I agree to move to assisted living? When did I develop the dementia you've been telling everyone I have?" I pulled out my phone and opened the saved listing, holding it up so everyone could see. "When did I write this description claiming I was relocating due to declining health?" Jason's face crumpled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the Harpers' $20,000, the forged signatures, the medical records claiming I was incompetent, the way he'd sold my memories and my mother's silver. "I can explain." he said desperately. "I was trying to help you. The house is too much for you. You're 70 years old, Mom. You shouldn't be living alone." "I'm 70 years old and perfectly capable of managing my own life," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his excuses. "I'm 70 years old and traveled 200 miles to visit my sister without any help. I'm 70 years old and manage my own finances, my own health care, my own decisions. What I don't need is my 42-year-old son who lives in my basement rent-free deciding what's best for me." Emily stepped forward then, her voice shaking with emotion. "Jason, how could you do this? How could you lie about Mom, forge her signature, steal from her? She's done nothing but support you your entire life, give you money, give you a place to live, believe in you when nobody else did. And you repay her by trying to steal her house?" Jason turned to Emily, and I saw the flash of anger in his eyes before he controlled it. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. I have debts, responsibilities. Mom has more than she needs. This house is just sitting here, appreciating in value while she barely uses half of it. I thought if I could sell it, pay off my debts, invest the rest, I could finally get ahead. I was going to take care of her. I was going to make sure she was comfortable. Comfortable in a facility I never agreed to enter?" I demanded. "Comfortable knowing you'd sold my home without permission? Jason, you weren't trying to take care of me. You were trying to cash in on 43 years of my life so you could pay for your truck and whatever other irresponsible purchases you've made." Detective Lawson moved closer to Jason, and I saw Carol Jennings from the real estate board was recording everything on her tablet. Martin stood near the fireplace, his face professionally neutral, but his eyes cold with contempt. The potential buyers were wide-eyed with shock, witnessing a family implosion they'd never forget. "Jason Whitmore," Detective Lawson said formally, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, theft, and elder abuse." He began reading Jason his Miranda rights while Jason stood there, shaking, tears now streaming down his face. The detective pulled out handcuffs, and that's when Jason seemed to fully break down. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice raw. "Don't let them do this. I'm your son. Please. I made a mistake, okay? I made a terrible mistake. But don't let them arrest me. We can figure this out. As a family. Please." He was sobbing now, his charming facade completely shattered, reduced to a scared man facing consequences he never thought would come. I looked at my son, at this man I'd raised, loved, enabled, and felt a confusing storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, disappointment, but surprisingly also relief. Relief that the truth was finally out. Relief that I'd stood up for myself. Relief that it was over. "You stopped being my son the moment you decided I was nothing more than an obstacle to your plans," I said quietly. "I'm not letting them arrest you, Jason. You're being arrested because you committed crimes. Against me. Against the Harpers. Against everyone who trusted you. This isn't me doing something to you. This is you facing the consequences of what you've done." Detective Lawson cuffed Jason's hands behind his back, and my son, my firstborn, the baby I'd brought home to this very house, was let out through my front door like a criminal. Because that's what he was. The potential buyers were escorted out as well, given business cards by the detective and told they might be contacted for witness statements. Carol Jennings approached me with compassion in her eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, "I need to get an official statement from you about the listing, the forged documents, everything. But I want you to know that the real estate board takes this extremely seriously. Your son's license will be revoked, not just suspended. He'll never work in real estate again, and we'll be cooperating fully with the criminal prosecution." Martin put his hand on my shoulder. "Dorothy, you were magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. We have everything we need for the criminal case and the civil suit to recover your money. The Harpers will get their deposit back from Jason's account, and you'll have grounds to sue for damages, emotional distress, all of it. He's going to pay for what he did, but I wasn't thinking about lawsuits or money. I was thinking about my house, now quiet again except for the handful of people who truly cared about me. Patricia, Emily, Martin, my neighbors. I was thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything because I'd been too trusting, too willing to believe the best of someone who didn't deserve it. And I was thinking about Thomas, wondering if he was watching somehow, hoping he understood why I'd had to do what I did. Emily wrapped her arms around me, and I let myself cry then, really cry. For the first time since Margaret's phone call had shattered my peaceful afternoon in Patricia's sunroom. I cried for the loss of my son, even though he'd chosen to lose himself. I cried for the years of enabling and hoping that had led to this moment. And I cried with relief that it was finally over. The neighbors rallied around me that evening, bringing casseroles and desserts, filling my house with warmth and support. Margaret made tea in my kitchen, her presence a reminder that I had real friends who cared about me as a person, not as a resource to exploit. Bill and Susan helped Patricia put my living room back the way I liked it, returning my mother's portrait to its proper place above the fireplace. Mr. Peterson sat with me on the porch, not saying much, just being there in that solid, dependable way that elderly neighbors have mastered. Emily stayed for a week, helping me change locks, secure my accounts, review all my legal documents to make sure Jason hadn't tampered with anything else. We found more evidence of his theft, small items missing that I'd attributed to my own carelessness, papers that had been moved, records that had been accessed. Emily installed security cameras and a new alarm system, insisted on setting me up with identity theft monitoring, and made me promise to keep my important documents in a safety deposit box at the bank. The legal proceedings moved quickly, probably because Jason's crimes were so well documented and so egregious. Detective Lawson told me they had enough evidence to convict him 10 times over. The forged signatures alone carried serious penalties, but when combined with the theft, the fraud against the Harpers, and the elder abuse charges, Jason was looking at 5 to 10 years in prison. His public defender tried to argue for a lesser sentence, claiming Jason was desperate and had made a terrible mistake out of financial pressure. But the prosecutor wasn't having it. "Your client didn't make a mistake," the prosecutor told the judge at Jason's arraignment. "He orchestrated a complex, premeditated fraud against his own mother, forging over a dozen documents, deceiving innocent buyers, and attempting to deprive a 70-year-old woman of her home and life savings. This wasn't a desperate act. It was a calculated betrayal. The Harpers got their $20,000 back, though they lost the house they'd loved and the dream they'd built around it. Melissa called me once to apologize again, crying, telling me how sorry she was for walking through my home and imagining replacing my memories with hers. I told her it wasn't her fault, that she and David had been victims too, that I hoped they'd find another house and be happy. She thanked me through her tears and said she'd never forget my kindness. I wondered if Jason had any idea how many people he'd hurt, how many ripples his actions had created. Jason wrote me letters from jail, dozens of them. At first, they were full of excuses and justifications. He'd been under so much stress, he'd made a bad decision, he didn't mean for things to go so far. Then they became angry. I'd overreacted. I was ruining his life. How could I let them arrest my own son? Finally, they became pleading. He was sorry, he'd change. Please forgive him. Please don't testify against him. Please give him another chance. I didn't respond to any of them. Martin advised me not to have any contact with Jason while the case was pending. And honestly, I didn't want to. What could I say to him? That I forgave him? I didn't. That I understood? I didn't. That I'd be waiting for him when he got out of prison? I wouldn't. Jason had made his choices, and now he was living with them. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. The trial happened 6 months later, and it was even worse than I'd expected. The prosecutor presented all the evidence: the forged documents with my signature, the fake medical records claiming I had dementia, the emails Jason had sent pretending to be me, the bank records showing how he'd spent the Harpers' money. They called the Harpers to testify, and watching Melissa cry on the witness stand as she described how excited they'd been to find their perfect home, how much they'd trusted Jason, how devastated they were to learn it was all a lie. That was excruciating. They called Margaret, who testified about seeing Jason show the house, about his new truck, about the items she'd seen him carry out of my house in boxes. They called Martin, who explained the forged power of attorney and the fake email address. They called Carol Jennings, who detailed the violation of real estate ethics and regulations. And then they called me. I testified for almost 3 hours, walking through my relationship with Jason, the money I'd given him over the years, my trip to Patricia's, Margaret's phone call, everything I'd discovered. The prosecutor asked me to describe what it felt like to learn my son was trying to sell my house, and I told the truth. It felt like my son had died, I said, and been replaced by a stranger who looked like him but had none of his humanity. It felt like every moment of love and trust between us had been a lie. It felt like I'd been stupid and blind and too willing to believe someone who never deserved my belief. Jason's defense attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, as a mother overreacting to a son's misguided attempt to help. He asked if I'd ever considered that Jason might have genuinely thought I needed to move to assisted living, that he was acting in what he believed were my best interests. I looked at the attorney, then at Jason sitting at the defense table, and said clearly, "My son wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to steal from me. Those are completely different things, and no amount of reframing will change that." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Jason guilty on all counts: fraud, forgery, theft, and elder abuse. At sentencing, the judge was unsparing. "Mr. Whitmore, you exploited the most sacred relationship we have, that between a parent and child. You violated your mother's trust, forged her signature, lied about her mental capacity, and attempted to deprive her of her home and financial security. You showed no remorse until you were caught, and even then your letters to your mother reveal more concern for yourself than for her well-being. I'm sentencing you to 8 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 4 years." 8 years. Jason would be 50 years old when he got out. I felt no satisfaction in the sentence, no triumph, just a heavy sadness that it had come to this. Emily squeezed my hand, and we left the courthouse together without looking back at Jason being led away in handcuffs. The civil suit was almost anticlimactic after the criminal trial. Martin sued Jason on my behalf for the $70,000 I'd given him over the years, plus damages for emotional distress and the cost of legal fees. The judge awarded me a judgment of $200,000, though Martin warned me I'd probably never collect most of it. Jason had no assets beyond his truck, which was seized and sold to partially reimburse the Harpers, but the judgment would follow him for the rest of his life, garnishing any wages he earned, any assets he acquired. He would never be free of the debt he owed me. I also updated my will, removing Jason entirely and leaving everything to Emily. I created a trust to ensure that even if something happened to me, Jason would never be able to claim he deserved part of my estate or had any legal standing to challenge my decisions. Martin made sure every document was ironclad, every possibility considered. Jason had taught me to protect myself, even from family. Especially from family. Life slowly returned to a new normal after that. Emily visited more often, sometimes bringing her partner Michael, who I liked immediately. They were talking about getting married, maybe starting a family, and I found myself excited about the prospect of grandchildren from a child who actually valued me. Emily and I grew closer through the whole ordeal, bonding over our shared experience of Jason's betrayal and our determination to move forward. I sold some of the furniture and belongings Jason had tried to steal, using the money to take a trip to Italy with Patricia, something I'd always wanted to do but had never felt able to afford because I was supporting Jason. We spent 3 weeks touring Tuscany, eating amazing food, visiting museums, laughing together in ways I hadn't laughed in years. I felt like I'd reclaimed my life, taken back the freedom and joy that Jason had been slowly draining from me. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, as if removing Jason and his lies and his schemes has allowed the walls to breathe again. I walk through the rooms sometimes, remembering the good years when my children were small and Thomas was alive, when we were a real family built on love instead of manipulation. Those memories are still mine, untainted by what came after. Jason's betrayal doesn't erase the happiness we once had. It just highlights how precious and rare that happiness was. I've started volunteering at a local organization that helps victims of financial elder abuse, sharing my story to help others recognize the warning signs. You'd be surprised how common it is, how many families are torn apart by greed disguised as care. I meet so many people who are going through what I went through. Children or caregivers or relatives who see elderly family members as piggy banks to be cracked open, who justify their theft as somehow being owed or deserved or necessary. I tell them what I learned, that protecting yourself isn't selfish, that setting boundaries isn't cruel, that pressing charges isn't betrayal. I tell them that you can love someone and still hold them accountable for their actions. I tell them that forgiving someone doesn't mean forgetting what they did or allowing them to keep hurting you. And I tell them that surviving this kind of betrayal, emerging on the other side with your dignity intact, is possible. Margaret and I have become even closer friends, meeting for lunch every week, working together in our gardens in the summer. She introduced me to a book club that meets monthly, and I've made new friends there. Women my age who are living full, independent lives, who don't see aging as a reason to give up or be managed by others. We talk about books and politics and our grandchildren, and nobody treats me like I'm fragile or incompetent or in need of supervision. As for Jason, I heard from Martin that he's been a model prisoner, taking classes, working in the prison library, apparently trying to better himself. Part of me hopes that's true, that he's using this time to genuinely change. But a larger part of me doesn't care anymore. Jason is no longer my problem, no longer my responsibility. I raised him, loved him, gave him every opportunity to become a good person. What he chose to do with all of that is on him, not me. Emily asked me once if I missed him, if I ever regretted prosecuting him, if there was any part of me that wanted to reconcile. I thought about it honestly before answering. I miss the boy he was, I told her. I miss the son I thought I had. But that person either never existed or died a long time ago. The man who tried to steal my house isn't someone I miss. He's someone I survived. The house is truly mine now in a way it never was before. I had the basement apartment renovated, turning it back into the workshop and craft space Thomas had originally designed. I'm learning to woodwork, taking classes at the community center, creating things with my own hands. There's something deeply satisfying about building instead of constantly repairing what someone else has damaged. I've also started writing down my story, my memories of Thomas and the early years with the children, recipes I want Emily to have, family history I want preserved. Not for Jason. He's lost the right to these memories, these connections. But for Emily, for her future children, for the family line that will continue forward built on love and honesty instead of manipulation and greed. People sometimes ask me how I'm doing, and I tell them the truth. I'm better than I've been in years. Removing a toxic person from your life, even when that person is your child, can feel like setting down a weight you didn't realize you'd been carrying. The betrayal hurt, deeply and permanently. The loss of the relationship I thought I had with Jason leaves a hollow space that won't ever be filled. But I've also discovered a strength and independence I'd forgotten I had. A life that belongs entirely to me. Choices that are mine to make without having to consider Jason's needs or feelings or potential reactions. The story you just heard was modified in names and places to protect the identities of the people involved. I'm not sharing this to judge, but with the hope that someone listening will stop and think about how many mothers, how many elderly parents, are suffering in silence within their own homes, being exploited by the very people who should be protecting them. I really wonder, if you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have chosen silence to keep the peace, or would you have dared to face everything to reclaim your own voice? Would you have pressed charges against your own child? Or would you have given them another chance, hoping this time would be different? I want to know your opinion because each story can become a candle that lights the path for others. God always blesses us, and I'm certain that courage leads to better days. Trust your instincts. Protect yourself. Don't let anyone, not even family, especially not family, convince you that you're not capable of managing your own life. And never, ever feel guilty for holding people accountable when they betray your trust, no matter what relationship you share. Your home, your finances, your life. These things belong to you, and you have every right to defend them. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone make you feel selfish or vindictive for standing up for yourself. And if you're in a situation like mine, if someone is trying to manipulate you or control you or take what's yours, speak up. Tell someone. Ask for help. There are people who will listen, who will believe you, who will stand beside you as you fight back. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I'm leaving you with two of the channel's favorite stories. I'm sure you'll be surprised.